Hello everyone, welcome to week 6 of our SHSAT training program. This week's English topic is going to be answering text structure questions. And a text structure question is basically a question that just asks about the textual organization. So it could be asking you to find some relationship between a cause and an effect of something in the passage, or maybe compare things in a passage, or analyze a comparison made by the passage. Anything like that falls under this category of questions. So as always, we're going to start with some tips. So the first tip is to break down parts of the text that you're asked about into smaller subsections. Like for example, if it's telling you about someone's life, and in their life, it says that what they did is they did all their homework and they studied for their test and they bought new shoes. And then the next day at school, everyone was complimenting their outfit. Well, basically, if we want to find the cause of these compliments, we can look to the past and we break it up into things he did. So he studied for his test, he did his homework, and he bought new shoes. Well, studying for the test and doing the homework don't really affect your outfit, but the new shoes do. So then, for example, that would be the cause of all these compliments that he's getting. So the next section is to figure out and use the fact that you know the order of events. So if it's asking you, especially about a cause and effect question, the effect of something is probably going to come right after the thing that caused it. It's definitely not going to come before, and it's probably not going to come very far after in the context of these passages. So if you just look at, the thing that you're trying to find the effect of, you can just look at what happened directly after, and that would probably be somewhere there. And as always, this is very important. You have to read the relevant parts of the passage again and again. So this is going to be a tip for basically every type of English question and for every single English question on the test. You need to go to the passage and reread it so that you know better what question you're answering and what you're answering about. So now we're going to look at some example problems. So again, I'm not going to read this passage because it's pretty long, but if you want to pause here and try and do it yourself, you can. Okay, so the question is, which sentence best supports the idea that Adderley succeeded in swimming across the English Channel because of her innovative approach to the challenge? So basically, we want to find the effect of her innovative approach. So it's essentially the same as asking which sentence supports the idea that her new innovative approach caused her to succeed. So that's the cause and effect that we're trying to analyze in this question. So now we're going to look back to the passage, right? It talks about how it talks about a lot of ways that she prepared. So she first improved her equipment. It talks here about how she covered herself with grease, and she sealed her goggles, and she designed a new bathing suit so that would help her swim. So, and I mean, before it's talking about past swimmers, so this is probably not really related to her swim. But afterwards, right, it talks about the way she was swimming. So in this paragraph, in paragraph 5, it talks about the start of her swim, and it's giving, her strokes were irregular, all that. So those are negative things. But after that, it says, using a new overhand stroke called the American crawl, Adderley eventually settled into a steady pace, briskly breaking through waves. So this actually talks about the fact that she invented a new stroke, which is called the American crawl, and used that to swim. And, as we know, she succeeded, she broke the record. So she was a very successful swimmer at this task. So now we look at the answer choices, right? So answer choice A, right? Yet at only 19 years old, Adderley not only became the first woman to accomplish this feat, she also broke the men's record by 2 hours. This talks about her success in swimming the channel, but it doesn't talk about her new innovative approach. So we know it's not A. The next one talks about, at first she shivered in the bone-chilling water even though she had covered her body in 8 layers of grease for insulation. So this does talk about her unique approach in covering herself with grease, but it doesn't talk about her success. So even though it talks about, the way she approached the challenge, it doesn't talk about the eventual result. And then answer choice D, no longer fighting against her, the sea pushed her towards the shore in victory. That's wrong too, because that doesn't talk about her approach. It just talks about the end of her swim when she was already at the finish line and she got to the end. So it's not D. And then we look at answer choice C, which is using a new overhand stroke called the American crawl, Adderley eventually settled into a steady pace, briskly breaking through the waves. So this does talk about her approach. It talks about the American crawl that she invented for this swim, but it also talks about the effect of her eventually being able to, briskly break through the waves, which is another way of saying she swam fast through the ocean. So the correct answer is answer choice C. So we're going to look at another passage here, which is about George Perkins Marsh, and his ideas about environmentalism. So feel free to pause here to try and answer it. Okay, so the question is, which of Marsh's ideas most influenced the environmental movement of the 1960s? AKA, which of these ideas resulted or caused the development and the start of the environmentalist movement at this time? So that's the cause and effect that we're looking at. So if we look at our answer choices, some human alterations to the environment are necessary. People lack an understanding of the environment. Human activities could damage the environment, and environmental degradation has been occurring for many years. So now we're going to look at the past. So here's where it talks about the environmental movement. It talks, the conservationists of that time sought to educate the public that the wilderness areas were worth preserving, and they were responsible for creating the national park and the national forest services. So that's basically what the environmental movement was, or the conservation movement. So we're looking at the past here. So answer choice A was, some alterations to the environment are necessary. Although, yes, he did talk about how sometimes it's necessary for humans to alter the environment, that wasn't a primary philosophy of his teachings. It was more so that we need to reverse the damage caused by humans to the environment. So it's not A, because although he did sometimes think that humans needed to alter it, this wasn't a primary idea that he had, and this wasn't reflected in the environmental movement, which a large part of which was to set off areas of nature for humans to not touch at all and not alter at all. So people lack an understanding of the environment. Yes, this was true, and he did think this. However, this again doesn't really reflect a big part of the environmental movement, which was to just create these national parks. It didn't really talk too much about the fact that people understood it or didn't understand it. So it's not B. And environmental degradation has been occurring for many years. Again, he did talk about this. This is something that occurred in his writings, but that's not necessarily a major part of it, and that's not necessarily the reason that humans decided to eventually create the National Park Service and National Forest Service. It was more so the fact that the environment was in a bad shape that they wanted to fix, so it's not D. And human activities could damage the environment. Now, this is actually most of what he talked about in his writings, and the fact that people knew that they could damage the environment was a large part of the reason they sectioned off areas of the US and the world to create national parks and national forests that human activities could not damage, to essentially preserve that part of the environment. So the correct answer to this question is C. And one last question is a poem. So again, you can feel free to pause and read it. Okay, so basically, an interesting thing about this poem is that it is essentially a conversation between this human man-made machine and nature. And if we read closely, it's not necessarily just nature, but I think it's specifically rain. So it's essentially this, concrete and steel eventually, I think it's a dam against rain, and they're sort of having this back and forth debate or conversation. So the comparison to sewing in lines 33-35 helps show that the structure, and then we need to figure it out. So the first thing we're going to do is go back to lines 33-35. So where it says, my sisters and brothers, we stitch across the rip you make. We are the steel thread to the human needle. We bind you up, we sew you. So he's essentially saying that, nature is creating this rip, and this machine is there to fix it. So now we're going to go to the answer choices. So it helps show that the structure, the first answer choices, enhances the beauty of the natural landscape. Well, actually, it's quite the opposite. It's saying how it goes against. It fixes an issue created by nature. So it's not enhancing the beauty of the natural landscape. If anything, it's going the other way and preventing nature from taking its toll on the landscape, or however you want to phrase it. So it's not E. Brings people together more effectively than nature does. Well, it actually does talk about sewing, but it's not necessarily in the sense that it's bringing people together. It's more so creating the analogy of nature ripping and it's sewing together the rip created by nature. So it's not F, because it never talks about humans. G is provides clear boundaries for natural environments. Well, it's not talking about boundaries. It's just talking about how it's going to fix an issue created by nature, or an issue it believes that nature has created. So it's not G. And H serves as a means for people to overcome an obstacle created by nature. Well, we actually know that this is probably the answer, because first of all, we've eliminated the first three, but also it talks about how it fixes nature, it goes against nature, it essentially acts as a counteraction to whatever nature does. So if, for example, there was an obstacle created by nature, then it would be fixing it, or it would be the way to get around this obstacle. So the correct answer is answer choice H. So yeah, that's about it for this week. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and we'll see you next week.